welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And let's start by, you should be by now familiar with the webinar tool. If not, take a look around, find the chat, tell us where you're located, kind of start the conversation there as well. Please post your questions in the Q&A tool, not in the chat. It does make it a little bit easier. We'll try to catch them if they're in a good place, but it does make it easier if they're in the Q&A tool. We'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. We're taking questions at the conclusion, so I'll try to get all of the ones at the end answered as much as we can with what time we have. It's going to run for 58 minutes, and we'll have you out of here on time, of course. And it wouldn't be possible to run this virtual conference without our sponsors. So thank you to all of our sponsors, particularly for this one, the Adolis tool. Very awesome tool, and everyone take a look at that. We've got Eric Byers from Adolis on here as well. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's introduce our topic and our speakers. The topic for today is securing the ICS Industrial Control Systems software supply chain. And let's start with Eric. Can you give us your bio, and then Joyce, and then Brian? Just tell us all about yourselves.
Sure. All right. Thanks. So many of you will know me from my role at inventing the Tofino firewall. And if you're buying Honeywell firewalls or Schneider firewalls or Invensys firewalls or, oh gosh, I don't know, Caterpillar firewalls or Schneider firewalls, you'll probably have bumped into a Tofino in one form or another. So that's my background. But I really got interested in the supply chain a few years, well, actually almost a decade ago, when I became aware of Russian attackers impacting and getting into the supply chain in European tier 2 vendors. And so I've really focused for the last decade on what can we do to protect our supply chain, our software supply chain, from software or malware being injected into it, or vulnerable open source software being used by attackers. We've got a bit of a serious vulnerable underbelly to our software world, particularly in OT. And so that's been my focus. I've been sitting on the CISA and NTIA SBOM working groups for the last 3 years, and of course running Adolis as the Chief Technology Officer, really trying to put together the tools we need today to protect ourselves from vulnerable software in the software supply chain. So that's me. That was a bit long-winded, but
no, great. Joyce.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, as Patrick said, wherever you are. My name is Joyce Hunter, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, or ICIT for short, and we are a nonprofit cybersecurity think tank. We reside at the areas of cybersecurity, national security, and critical infrastructure. We do education outreach and convening. We provide research and webinars and outreach types of briefings. We also have published a book called Securing the Nation's Critical Infrastructures, which addresses all 16 critical infrastructures as designated by CISA.
Great. Brian.
Hey, thanks. I'm Brian Owen, the head of product security at Aviva. For those of you who might not be familiar with Aviva, we're an industrial software maker. Everything from design, build, operate, and optimize in the industrial world is what our software is about. I'm really pleased to be on this panel. My background is a professional chemical engineer. And in that field, we're all about ingredients and what goes into our supply chains. So I feel for chemical engineers, it's almost a natural topic. And then just to close out, I would be remiss from being from the Pacific Northwest many years ago. This is Mount St. Helens Day, one of the most catastrophic events ever. And that's the way supply chain is. Another way to think about it is let's avoid those catastrophic events. So thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm also from the Pacific Northwest, and I remember it well. All right. I'm going to jump right into the questions. Joyce, I'm going to start with you. Eric raised the issue of supply chain, the soft kind of underbelly of supply chain. And we recently had, not recently, but even recently, but in the past, the classic example, of course, is SolarWinds, and there have been many others. So what are we learning from the software supply chain breaches, and how do we incorporate those into our governance policies?
Well, first of all, we have to learn from them. It's crucial to strengthening our organization's security posture and preventing future incidents, hopefully. So I have a few steps. I may not go through all of the ones that I can think of offhand, but these should be going into your governance policies. Number one is conduct a thorough postmortem analysis of the breach to identify the root cause and the specific vulnerabilities that were exposed. A lot of people try to get over it and people don't like bad news. I mean, let's be serious. They don't like bad news. They don't like things bad to happen. They want to kind of gloss over it and get to the next topic or move beyond it. You can't. Rip the Band-Aid off the sore and really kind of delve in there and poke around. Determine which policies and procedures were not effective. Go through each one of them to prevent another breach and identify those areas for improvement. Do a complete deep dive, update your governance policies. If you look at your governance policies, and I know that, but part of my background is I was also the deputy CIO and the acting CIO at the Department of Agriculture. And sometimes we create policies that overrun other policies that kind of negate other policies. And so they're kind of piled up on each other. And so you got to go through and purge all those old policies so that the new ones can really be very effective. Consider implementing security controls such as software composition analysis, vulnerability scanning, and code reviews to ensure that your software supply chain is secure. Maybe another one is implement a regular security awareness training program. Maybe establish, most of you have a continuous monitoring and assessment to detect and respond to any security incidents promptly. You should always do an analysis and do a regular, I would say, enacting exercise so that you can see where some of those vulnerabilities are and engage with industry groups. I mean, everybody, we're all in this together. It's not so bad. Yeah, you're going to get probably some industry backlash, but the best thing is to talk to other groups to stay up to date with the emerging threats and the best practices for securing the supply chain.
Fantastic. And that's, I like the recommendation for going through your policies and looking for things like conflicts and gaps, because that's often there. At that policy level, that's really kind of setting the tone for how the organization is going to take on this at a governance level. And of course, if you need to enforce anything, no policy, no enforcement, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Brian, what should we be doing or not doing to address the risk of software backdoor implants in the ICS supply chain? You deal with a software company, right? You are a software company. You create this stuff. Give us an example of how at least your philosophy, you don't have to give away any secrets about how you do these things, but what's your general philosophy on keeping these backdoors out of your software?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I probably gave some of that away in my intro, but as like we do in science and chemistry, we have analyzers, and we analyze multiple points in our process, not just before it goes out the door, but as early as we can during development, early and often. And the idea is that we really want to get a feeling that I break it down into 3 questions. We want to know, do we have the bits that we think we have, right? Did we bring things in and that's exactly what we think we are? The number 2 is, are we actually running the bits that we think we are? Because after you bring them in, things can change. So you have to stay on top of it. And then how long can we trust the software and the bits? So that's really a lot of the vulnerability piece. It's been said that software rots like fruit. So you have to keep it fresh and current. So those are the things we really focus on: monitoring and analyzing the data. The pieces with respect to what maybe are as well intended, but maybe I think overemphasized is passing a lot of paperwork around, sending questionnaires around, and thinking you've mitigated risk. If you don't have analyzers in place, really looking at the software, you're missing a big part of the problem.
What do you mean by analyzers?
So yeah, in the software world, we might not call it analyzers. It's more often called scanners, but there are security tools and the like that can really inspect software and can do a pretty darn good job of it. I'm sure Eric will talk about that. His company makes a great tool in that area, but there's many others, from static to dynamic to binary analysis, and all these analyzers just help a great deal to make sure that in the supply chain, nothing's been implanted that shouldn't be there.
Patrick,
Yeah,
whoops, I'm sorry, go ahead.
okay. I was going to say something Brian brings up in this whole question, backdoors. It's important to think that the backdoors can show up in multiple ways. I mean, when you have something like solar winds, the backdoor got in there because a foreign government agency injected it into the build pipeline of solar winds. And so you've got these very deliberate, malicious attempts to get a backdoor in. And so that's where we usually go. But for the most part, the backdoors that people use are a form of living off the land, like Log4j. The Iranian security agencies and actors love Log4j because they don't have to inject anything. We put it there ourselves. We put it everywhere. So I think this ties back to what Brian is saying, is it's really important to be using tools or analyzers to go and look and understand what you've got. And that backdoor may not be a problem. Log4j was not a problem in November, 2 Novembers ago. It became a problem on December 13th or December 11th, when suddenly the world, I mean, it was a potential problem, but nobody was exploiting it until suddenly, surprise, the world gets to know that there's this glaring vulnerability. So there's a couple of things that I think is really important. It's not a one and done. You need to build up what's effectively an asset list. And we already know how to build asset lists. This is an asset list of your software, not, hey, I've got PLC vendor XYZ's HMI sitting here, but more, and it's got the following, it's got OpenSSL, it's got BusyBox, it's got whatever. What's it got in it? And that's really, it's an extended asset list. And then you got to be working that asset list all the time. What was good today or what was good yesterday may be rotten tomorrow. So I think without those asset lists, we're sunk. We have to know what's there.
And it warmed my heart, Brian, to hear you say, as soon as you start putting the first code down, you build in the security by design. That has to be a part of the build of any kind of software product. We call them the authority to operate. Don't come running around to my office the day before you go into production and want me to sign off on something. Let's show me what you have done as far as securing those codes as you have been developing.
I'd even back it up from secure as design. It's just damn good design to know what you're building. Don't build a house if you don't know what materials you're using.
Well, that's actually an exciting point with the IIoT movement. At least I'm very optimistic that this is a chance for us to really learn from what really didn't, from a design perspective, make sense security-wise decades ago. Now we have a chance to get it right and really kind of start fresh on some of these IIoT infrastructures. So that's certainly a big thought of our mind and building security in from the very start.
And by the way, I mean, we're sort of blaming the vendor right now, but there's a lot that the asset owner, the people who get the software, can do to figure out what they actually bought. Again, go back to the example of Log4j. I heard a very, very good presentation by one of the CISOs at one of the Fortune or big three US defense contractors, saying that he basically redirected his entire security team to phone suppliers to ask them if they used Log4j for weeks, for 2 whole weeks, he stated. That's a phenomenal waste of resources. Everybody's eyes off the ball. They're making phone calls, not checking security logs. And it really shows how the providers like you guys, Brian, have to know what you put in the software, but the customer at the end of the day has to know what's in the software they bought. What, it's like holding a can of soup. You buy a can of soup, you need to know what's in the soup. And if you're allergic to peanuts, you better make sure that peanuts aren't on that list.
Right. And Eric, tell us, you run a company that does this, right?
Yeah.
So if, for example, there is a Log4j, hopefully not again in December, right before Christmas, to put everyone to work over the holiday. But if there is a Log4j for the next Log4j-ish thing that is, we'll say, already embedded, wasn't caught by, say, like Brian's processes of catching these things early on or building them well, but it makes it out, it's installed everywhere. And how do we find these things? Like, how do you save this poor guy that spent weeks having his people call around? How do you save these people some time?
Well, I think this is where the whole software bill of materials movement comes. And Brian's processes would not have caught Log4j. Log4j is a legitimate piece of software. It's still a legitimate piece of software. The truth is that vulnerabilities show up. So, Brian would have said, yeah, my guys are using Log4j, which I don't think your guys use Log4j very often, once or twice, but you don't actually, but just theoretically assume Brian's team uses lots of Log4j. There's nothing wrong with that. They have to. Where the problem comes up is when Log4j suddenly goes from being a perfectly vulnerability-free piece of software to a Swiss cheese. And it's that ability to react that I think matters. And so there are tools. I mean, we make a tool. I was at an Auto ISAC meeting yesterday where a bunch of companies were showing tools both for the people writing the software and the people using the software, how they could detect from the software bill of materials what the heck was in the soup they bought.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's that whole Christmas time a few years ago is still painful to remember, but I will shout out to Eric because we had the right tools. When CISA put the order out to everyone, hey, go inventory everything, we were able to do that quickly. And where we were able to spend our time then is on the actual remediation on the affected products instead of spending all your time searching. So that was really a help, and didn't waste everyone's Christmas at Aviva anyway.
And I was really driven to do that because of my time at Belden, where you guys will probably, most of the people on this call will probably remember the disaster that happened to OpenSSL, which is a perfectly good piece of software, but they had Heartbleed.
Yeah.
I was the chief security officer, or sorry, chief technology officer, and sort of responsible for security problems at Belden. I just didn't even know where to start looking in our product lines at that time for which group out of the 8 divisions that had development centers, which group used as OpenSSL. I couldn't even answer that question. That's changed a lot. The tools are out there. And I mean, this is sort of my passion right now. Give people the tools to be able to make those answers in minutes, not weeks.
So you have these, like you said, the can of soup, and you need to know what is in the ingredients in the soup. Like you said, if you are allergic to peanuts or other ingredients in that soup, then that could be very devastating for you. So there are measures that can be taken to incentivize stakeholders, right, to provide that software bill of materials or to even adequately disclose. The first one everybody thinks of course, is government regulations. And then everybody's hands goes up and goes, oh my God, we don't want the government to regulate everything. But let's look at this, for example. We are so independent as Americans, and we are so fiercely tied to our federation that the nation states are not. Right? I mean, they are united. They are put together a united front to actually put these regulations in place in those countries that provide this information. Now, I think we have finally learned our lessons, and I see some of the software companies coming together and talking. Like I mentioned before, industry groups, get together and talk about what kinds of things go into the soup, what makes up the guacamole, what makes up those kinds of things, and that can be done through regulation. The other is liability and insurance. Organizations, and there's a big argument around cybersecurity insurance. Organizations can be held liable for damages resulting from security vulnerabilities, and that's what the SEC rules are doing. Not only are they talking to boards about being liable, but they're talking about the individual people on the boards also being vulnerable and held liable. So these are kinds of things that we have to look at. We have to provide those industry standards and best practices in order to encourage best practices for software security, including the use of SBOMs, collaboration and information sharing.
And Joyce, I think that ship has actually sailed. I mean, we have all the regulations and all the requirements that have come out of Executive Order 14028. I mean, that's happened. Companies, if you're going to sell to the US government and you sell critical software, next year you're going to be supplying software bill of materials. If you're supplying medical devices, this October, you are going to be supplying software bill of materials. And so I think that ship has actually sailed. We are going to have, companies are going to be supplying software bill of materials. And we've had a really interesting thing we've seen happening in the food and beverage industry. Several of the very large food companies are saying, hey, if it's good enough for the US government, it's good enough for us. If you're going to supply software packaging lines, et cetera, to us, this is a big food company, you will supply software bill of materials. So I think it's not just industry groups getting together. I think this has happened already. It's just a matter of months and years before everybody's going to feel this bite.
Yeah, and then there's CMMC as well. So I think the both of them together will provide the, if you will, coverage that you are talking about and that we are talking about today.
I guess I'll be the anarchist here just for a moment because it's fun. But one of the areas that I think the federal government would like to be involved with, or at least is considering, is in the area of certifications. And I keep thinking that what's happening in the open source world with security research, if we were able to open up that part of call it testing, not certification, but make it easier for security professionals that do security research to bring their skills to this problem, so that IoT devices really get a lot of eyes on it and a lot of testing, because we'll be as good as all the testing we can muster into these products.
Yeah, I think there's also a risk on depending on liability. Go back to my famous the last example, Log4j. Who do you sue for Log4j? A bunch of open source developers who, you don't want to destroy the open source market. This has produced a lot of value to the industry, and yet you can't sue an executive at a company because they used open source. That's standard practice now.
Yeah, liability for defect is different than liability for exploitation, isn't it?
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is a question I've got for all three of you. What are you seeing in terms of, because we talk about vulnerabilities, vulnerability disclosure is a big deal, right? There's a lot of controversy around this. How is it done? Let's just kind of put some of that aside. Do you disclose 0 days? That's kind of a different discussion. What I'm interested in is, what are you seeing in terms of trends of vendors now with frankly, with something like a front door, like an actual product security team that can receive notice of a vulnerability from a researcher and do something about it, and then produce something like, here's a hash or an SBOM to do something about this vulnerability. Here's how you find it, and here's how you fix it. What are you doing? What are you seeing from the vendor side on this to actually give us a front door and a place to give them the information about vulnerabilities?
Brian, do you want to handle that, or I'm happy to handle that?
Yeah, I'll just be very direct and say Aviva's had a front door for a very long time, and we very much appreciate CISA, previously ICS CERT, for their role in coordination if people don't always want to report directly to the vendor for some of the liability reasons that were already mentioned. So I think that system's actually working quite well for the larger organizations and smaller organizations. There's still some norms that need to emerge there.
Okay, that was my question, is that these small companies. Joyce, did you have a comment? Yeah.
That is, as I mentioned in my opening comments, that is a problem. And the word I was looking for was systemic failure. So you have a car, right? That Ford Explorer is made up of multiple parts, and a lot of those parts are from those small vendors. So, how can you support them to ensure that that front door is open, because they are scared to death of losing that Ford contract, right? And so we've got to provide some coverage for them so that they feel comfortable in revealing some of those defects to their suppliers and to other people in the industry.
There's some really good ISO standards for what companies need to do to have that front door. How do you, what's your vulnerability response standards? I can't quote the number right now. I think it's ISO 13 something something something. It'll be 5 digits. But what I've noticed is the market has improved, and the response has improved dramatically over the last decade to vulnerability notification. I remember I've submitted more than my fair share with my team of vulnerabilities over the years. And I remember submitting a glaring vulnerability in a PLC from a major manufacturer. And the response I got was a cease and desist letter from their legal team.
Yeah.
I would be shocked to get that crap now. That just wouldn't happen.
Yeah, it's not an accident that the CISA's cyber performance goals has security.txt as one of the very short list of things that all companies need to get implemented right away.
Yeah, biggest problems I see right now is exactly what Joyce said. It's the tier 2 companies. We found some vulnerabilities in a pretty important RTU used in the oil and gas space, and the poor company, they weren't malicious. They weren't sending cease and desist. They just didn't know who to take we'll send it to tech support. Are you kidding me? Oh, and by the way, just send the entire report via email. Are you doubly kidding me? Right. You really want that sent by email? I don't know who's listening to your emails, boys, but if your security is on your product is as good as your security on your email, you don't want that report sent to you by insecure email. So I think it is coaching. It's what Joyce says, and CISA has been pretty good at telling people, what they have to do. I also think, from being involved in a bunch of these companies, when they respond like deer in the headlights, after the first time, they never have that problem again. They get a process.
One of the things I'm still looking for is a solution for, there are small companies that are making low-cost devices. They're not always made in countries that have rigorous rules, if you understand what I mean. And they'll produce thousands, if not millions, of these very low-cost devices to do, whether it's just IoT or IIoT, and they're affordable. And there are a lot of companies that are operating on budgets that's where they go to get their solutions. Though there really isn't an option for those companies that is affordable, right? So what is do we, since we can't really, we can't really stop it on the front end, from the back end, is that where we're just stuck with that for now?
I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, because remember what was a couple of years ago, we had this chip debacle where the federal government, was buying these chips because they were the lowest price option,
right?
Which is what our wonderful federal government, which, I used to be a part of, does. They go to the lowest price option, and there is that chip that everybody had a heart failure over. So that's another question. So, what do you do in those kinds of situations where you have to say that you have to do more, checking and vetting and all things that are coming across the bow?
Okay.
Patrick, from a software perspective, it's an excellent question, and what we see happening at Aviva, and I think some of the other very large software companies are of this mind as well, is that getting common frameworks that even the small guys can use. So you have libraries that are really well constructed and designed and can be used as a starting point, even if you're small company. So you can get the benefit of other people's great work, and the Linux Foundation is doing a great job there, and so is Aviva and other companies. So it. On the other hand, it concentrates the risk into these frameworks, but the good news is that for all this innovation going on, people can adopt it rapidly and get good security right from the start.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And Brian, I'd also add the other thing, as an operator of a small company right now, we're 28 people, so we're not a big company, and we make software. One of the things that brings tears to my eyes and is highly inefficient is right now, I think I filled out 6 or 7 different detailed security review reports. These are, sometimes these are running hundreds of pages. There's no sort of consistency. And if we could come up with consistent reporting request mechanisms, I think you guys have run into the same thing. Every single contract we get demands an entirely different set of responses on why we're secure. And that's more expensive than the security some days.
Yeah, just the human time to respond to all of that.
Yeah.
That leads me to another concept. There's been talk of, much like you'd get like an Energy Star rating on an appliance that says this appliance is use this much electricity over this span of time, and you can therefore make your purchasing decisions based on kind of some arbitrary rating or in theory, some graded rating. There's talk of something like, and I hate to use this word, but there really isn't anything better yet, but like a cyber star for the things that you buy that says, when you buy this, at least at this moment in time, we know this will change drastically within the second after it's rated. But what are your thoughts on actually issuing something like that for IIoT that says, here it is, it's been tested by some lab somewhere against this standard or framework, and we gave it a 3 or a 4 out of 5, whatever it might be.
But you have to have those consistent standards, right? I mean, they have to be consistent all the way across the board. Healthcare does it with their star rating system, right? So the public actually rates the healthcare facility, and then that star shows up on a star rating for the Center for Medicare Medicaid Services. Like you said, the Energy Star has it. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have it for software, hardware in this area.
I think we have to tread carefully here. Brian and a few of you will remember common criteria, and what a rolling wreck that was, because yes, it was a consistent set of criteria that was extraordinarily expensive to and also largely could be misused to certify that if you said your painted box was green, that it really was green, but it didn't actually make any difference. I think probably more important isn't, has somebody certified this box as secure, because the next morning it might not be, but has this company got processes in place to design a secure box or a patchable box? And do they have processes in place to be able to, detect when a new vulnerability is showing up and how they can get that to the customer? So I think it's much more process driven than it is, and then you can put your secure star sticker on the side of your products if you have that process.
Yeah, maybe so. There's maybe more than one answer here. very concerned that with the balkanization of the internet and these kind of certifications would proliferate and just become a lot of burden for not much real security. So that, to the extent that testing and so forth is, providing value, all for it. But when it becomes just about the ceremony and getting a check mark, that concerns me. And then, as you said, cybersecurity changes. Certified products have been breached many times, so that's not necessarily the answer by itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, we did, you're absolutely right, Brian. It became, with common criteria, it became either stupidly expensive or a show.
But some of the things we were talking about earlier, like if the star rating said, hey, this company has a front door to report issues.
Yeah.
They've used frameworks that are well known, et cetera. There's probably some level that could be put on an indication that would save some consumers or companies time when they go to procure things. But it's a never-ending challenge to keep systems secure, especially the longer they live, the more difficult it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of the process approach. I always struggle with this concept when it comes up, just because I see why they're asking for it, but I think that the answer is much more nuanced than just saying, yeah, put a sticker on it that says, hey, it was secure when we tested it, because for all these reasons. But yeah, I like the process approach. And Brian, you raised a really good, interesting point about the balkanization of the internet and just balkanization of a product in general, because with a lot of these things from a supply chain perspective, made in doesn't mean made in, it means assembled in, right? It's just, we put it together in this location and therefore it's got it was arguably sourced in this spot, but that's not really the case. Yeah. Okay, so we've got basically the pressure to provide SBOMs. Eric, you mentioned some of these things. We've got, it was in the Executive Order 14028. It's also in the National Security Memorandum that came out a while ago. It's in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, also, as Joyce mentioned, is liability as well. What if you've got companies, clearly we're seeing a reticence from the market to take ownership of this problem, right? Not everywhere, but it's enough to where it's making it into like language from the executive branch saying, hey, you need to do this. If it wasn't an issue, it probably wouldn't be the case. So if you've got suppliers that won't provide SBOMs or are really resisting this liability approach, what do you do?
Well, I mean, this is exactly what I've been concerned about. And this is what, I've been trying to build as a product, or have built as a product, is something that will work great if you're a supplier and it can provide you services and analysis. But your suppliers may not be able to give you SBOMs for a variety of reasons, and not the least of which is they've no longer produced the product, or they no longer have the source code, or they sold that division, or they bought that division. There's tons of reasons. So I think that it's really critical that we are not dependent on demanding software bill of materials just for the latest product being shipped out, and covering our whole spectrum, especially in this space in the IIoT world, because we're using 20-year-old gear. So we need we need SBOMs for those 20-year-old gear. So I think this sounds maybe like a little bit of an infomercial, but the truth is that it's core to my beliefs is that it's not just the supplier's problem. We have to provide tools, and we're providing tools to the end users to give them that visibility. And I'm going to give you a real good example of this. So one of our users of the platform we supply is a large integrator for the food and beverage industry. They were told they had to supply SBOMs with the packaging lines they're putting in, and they had sub-suppliers that were able, either not able or not willing to do that, but they still had contractual obligations to deliver SBOMs. They didn't own the product, but they were shipping the product. They had, so, that was what we ended up doing for them, is helping them sort out the software bill of materials for the uncooperative or unavailable vendors to them, and give them a full set. And I think it's absolutely, with them, we've really shown that it's a solvable problem. We don't have to go back. It's great when you have a company like Aviva that is so in the forefront and so involved. That's happy path, but we're not going to get happy path for another 10 years.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just jump on that. Thank you, Eric. But professional software development, it's not a hard sell. And particularly in the industrial world, we have many companies that they build widgets and they have to track the entire genealogy of their widget anyway. This is a concept that's very well known in industry. It's a little bit newer in the software world, but it's not a hard sell until we get closer to the consumer world, where maybe people aren't so used to it. So I'm more optimistic that we'll see these professional software development practices be democratized to everyone, thanks to tools like you're building, Eric, and other pushes from the government, making that really happen.
I see it happening, being in a think tank, kind of see a broader picture of what's going on out there. And I do see some reticence. It's like having the title on your car or everything on your car following it. And some people do keep accurate records on what has happened to their vehicle before they sell it, and some people don't. And so, unfortunately, we're going to be, for several years, as Brian and Eric has said, for several years, we're going to be plagued by this, software bill of materials that stopped at a particular point, and nobody thought to update it or tell what happened to it once it was integrated someplace else.
Perhaps the good news is that the bill of materials don't have to be perfect to deliver risk reduction. So we can start now with what we have and really make a huge difference. So again, I'm very optimistic about it.
Got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like releasing a software product. Long time ago, back in the dark ages, I worked with Lotus Development Corporation. So I understand completely about when it's done. When do you actually release that product to the marketplace? That's what's going to, have a lot of hiccups in this SBOM area, because people are going to now look for that artist perfection before they release the product.
Yeah, I can see that as well. And I even in my conversations, some of them are really looking at their practices, really looking at when they want to release. These early release with kind of alpha beta level security, and then just let the users kind of beat it to death. Some of that's actually shifting. I'm starting to see the needle move in a direction of, well, let's hold that back a little longer and test it a little more before it goes out, which is a good practice. And we've talked about a lot of the complexity and some of the bigger, harder challenges in this software supply chain security, or supply chain security in general. Brian, I want to ask you, since you're the quintessential optimist, and I've known you for many years, and I love that about you. So tell me some of the easier things to do, like what's the low-hanging fruit if you're just hearing about this, or you want to start developing, or maybe you're finally kind of understanding this is a serious thing for you and you're not going to be able to escape it. If you need to move and you want to just start somewhere, what are some of the easy things you can do?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And my direct answer to that is, from a software perspective, all of the software should be digitally signed. And this gets us back to helping with that liability problem. It's when you're able to take ownership of the software and have a way to track who created this software, that's a great story by itself, but there's more. And the great thing about software that has been signed is that it enables defenses that can be used at during operation, right? You can lock operating systems down so that they'll only run signed software and so forth, and that'll cut a swath, a giant swath of risk away. Doesn't get it all, because like Eric says, people learn how to live off the land, but this is a great step forward just by signing the code.
Okay, anything else? Just digital signatures?
I'm just going to go with that and see
Okay.
what Eric and Joyce had to say.
Yeah, I think that's one good measure. The challenge I see where it can all fall apart is in these software integration. You know, you sell the software to a big defense integrator, and they put it into another system, which becomes something else. It morphs into something else, and then they put it into a warfighter or something like that, and it becomes something else still, because then it's integrated with other products. So is the actual digital signature at the very end, or is it along the way the digital signatures are applied?
Yeah, for us, it's always at the very end, before the software finishes its final QC. That's when the signatures are release signatures are applied, and that's how we can share with our customers that, hey, these hashes, these are the ones that you can trust and the ones that you should expect to keep running on your system.
And we absolutely, as we're analyzing and building software bill of materials, we see digital signatures all up and down the chain, but it's the one at the end that is the one that really matters, because it's stating that the Aviva software, you know, is and all its components is ultimately the responsibility of Aviva. But we definitely see signatures up and down the chain, and particularly with open source or with a proprietary software that's been injected into or been built into products.
Great.
Yeah, and Joyce, good point about how you can get these, I guess, kind of an amalgamation or a build of other builds into one big thing. And even then, you're not going to get a digital certificate on that, because it was more of an assemblage of some other components into a new thing, right?
Right, exactly.
And that's where I think what Eric was mentioning, and even in those cases, you can come after the fact and do some, reviews of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
where your quality controls are really going to have to be top notch in certifying that what you see is what you get, and what you install is what you saw. And so that's going to be critical at the end, quality control and quality analysis.
Yeah, and we haven't even touched on things like, once you get that far, how do you do change management going forward, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because when in change management, you have the human element, right?
Yes.
So in the human element in the software supply chain, you have to create a comprehensive and effective strategy that addresses those risks with both technology and human factors. You can't have one without the other.
What are some of the human factors?
Well, humans. That's the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing in the human factor. Whether they are educated enough, whether they had the experience enough, whether they all of those things that come, have they been given the thorough background checks? But we have seen in the news that is not necessarily always the final strategy for that human element in there. So you have to look at the vulnerabilities and how people adapt, and whether you use AI in conjunction with a human strategy, which I highly recommend. You can't just rely on artificial intelligence or machine learning to get you to your end result. So I think it has to be a combined effort, and I don't think we can rush through it. I think you have to take your time.
I think one of the things that we can do with the human element is use the buddy system, maybe a scuba diver term, sorry, but we do it in coding too, right? So it's never a case where one person can change production code. You always need to have extra reviewers and so forth. And same thing at integration. Maybe there are some aspects of maintaining the IIoT infrastructure that really need to have at least two people involved, so you can safeguard against that human factor.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
continuous monitoring and improvement. Like Eric said, it's not a one and done. You just don't install it and, say, oh, well, I'm not going to put this patch in just because I don't feel like it, or because I don't, there's no time for it, or because the product owner does not want to take the system down, or all of those things. You have to have that part of your mandate, continuous monitoring and improvement. But we have seen more times than not that if you don't do the appropriate patching, you're going to have problems.
When this gets to some of Eric's point earlier around process, I mean,
Yeah.
Joyce, you're describing more of a mature state for a lot of organizations, because getting to continuous monitoring is really no small task. That is a significant lift. So you need to have a process in place, and good process in place, because if you just monitor bad process, well, you're not going to get very far, right? It's going to just kind of show failure faster.
I'm going to just share something Moms Mabley said. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got.
Okay. That's really good. Yeah, it's simple, but it's true. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I like the idea of the process and the continuous monitoring. I know that it's going to be challenging for some to get to that continuous monitoring state, but it is definitely where you want to be, to keep an eye on things in a regular state all the time. Yeah. Okay, let's shift a little bit to vulnerability management as well. So I'm going to ask Eric, how can organizations, whether they're asset owners or vendors, right? You need both sides of this, focus on the vulnerability management piece that matters, right? What do you do to prioritize this? Because right now, I know whether it's either side, like the asset owner or the vendor, they feel like it's whack-a-mole, right? So how do you prioritize this? Is it like the Summit promoted this, next, never now kind of thing? How do you prioritize these things?
No, there's starting to be some really, really good tools out there to help prioritize vulnerabilities. And that's a darn good thing, because you can easily get buried in what I call the vulnerability tsunami. So the first thing you think about in vulnerabilities is, yep, there may be a vulnerability in a piece of software. And I'll go back to one of my favorites, OpenSSL's Heartbleed. But if the developers didn't compile in the Heartbeat components, then it wasn't exploitable. So the first question is, is there a vulnerability? And hopefully that's there's a lot of tools out there. Again, that's something we do. We'll look and we'll see if the vulnerability is listed against that component. But the next step, and the one that's probably the most important, is, okay, what are the functions that are actually compiled in? What functions are used? Is it exploitable? Can the bad guys actually get to that? And so that next stage is exploitability. And that's where there's a bunch of standards coming out, or have been come out, like the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, VEX. For an end user's point of view and a software developer's point of view, it's a really good way to communicate what's known about the exploitability. So you can focus on exploitable vulnerabilities, not just any old damn vulnerability. And then the third thing to watch for is anybody actually exploiting it. Is there exploits in the wild? And you have that CISA list and other lists out there. And so we're starting to integrate those in as well, so that we can say, here's a vulnerability, here's an exploitable vulnerability, here's an exploitable vulnerability that's actively being exploited. I guess which one you might want to start with. And it's that prioritization. And I think the next few years, we'll see a lot of development towards vulnerability prioritization. Because if we don't prioritize and we just say we patch everything, we're going to patch nothing. There's like they say, if everything's a crisis, then nothing's a crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian, are you going to add something?
It's a chicken little. The sky is falling. And then when it really does, nobody pays attention.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think vulnerability management is, you know, a tsunami. I wanted to say volcano just to get Mount St. Helens in there again, but really isn't a volcano. It's not generally a crisis for most things. The closest thing we have in supply chain was really Log4j, and having that central coordination from the government to really center everyone's effort was great. But a lot of vulnerabilities just don't have the kind of impact that one did, and can be managed as what I consider routine business. That it's not the now, it's not the never, it's just the next. It's in the next category, and getting in a cadence where your systems are being serviced on whatever makes sense for your business is a really important part of the operational life cycle.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, is it internet facing? Right, some things in there to prioritize, right? Is it internet facing? Is it something in your crown jewel set, right? Is it somewhere that's just really super critical? May not be internet facing, but that might not be the now, but would be the next. And then you also have managed cycles on those, because especially in the industrial world we're dealing with, typically you want to work within what we call a scheduled outage versus an unscheduled outage to make these changes. Yeah.
One of the things I'm really excited about, since you mentioned internet facing, is there's a huge capability difference between an internet connected device and cloud services and traditional. So when I said I'm really optimistic about IoT, that's one of the reasons. These devices can be kept up to date. So we're not talking about patching cycles that are years long. A lot of times it can be very, very quick, even hours we've seen for internet facing services.
Yeah.
It's also one of the advantages of the cloud deployments. You know, it's a heck of a lot easier to patch a cloud container in AWS than it is to ship a patch out to 10,000 devices.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a lot of this really, Eric, you mentioned the VEX. It is speaking to the maturity of the SBOM market, right? We now have things that are machine readable, fast processing. It's not something humans have to go dig around in. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up. We're hitting that window. So thanks again to the speakers for your amazing insights. I really appreciate all the knowledge you've shared with us. Adolis, awesome. Thank you so much for sponsoring. Everyone, please go check them out. And your support, make sure that we all have this great content to share. Really appreciate it. So thanks to the attendees. We appreciate your time. And since we're the last session of the event, I'm going to hand it back over to Lucian to close us out.
All right. Thank you, Eric, Brian, and Joyce and Patrick for this session. Thank you all for sticking around. Thank you, the 6,522 attendees throughout the 2 days for joining us. Just a quick reminder before we part ways, we do have Energy Days in June, so feel free to join us there. Smart Buildings in September. Then we have ICS Cybersecurity Day in October, and then we come back to manufacturing and supply chain on December 7th. With that, I'd like to wrap up the session. This concludes the program for today. Thank you.